The snow along the edge of the forest had turned black from smoke and engine oil. It was early morning, just after sunrise, on March 5th, 1944, somewhere near the muddy roads outside Tarnopol in western Ukraine. A cold wind moved across the frozen fields, carrying the distant sound of artillery. Inside a Soviet tank dug halfway into the earth, Sergeant Ivan Kolesnikov pressed his eye against the narrow vision slit and waited. His breath fogged the metal interior of the turret. The engine behind him rumbled softly like a sleeping animal. Everyone inside the tank knew what was coming. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German Panthers were moving toward them.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
For months, Soviet crews had learned to fear that name, Panther, a machine that seemed impossible to stop. Its long 75mm gun could destroy Soviet tanks from distances where return fire meant almost nothing. Many Red Army crews believed that once a Panther saw you first, your chances were already gone. That morning, many Soviet soldiers expected another brutal lesson. But something new was waiting on that battlefield, something the German crews had not yet learned to fear. Only a few hundred meters away, hidden behind the same frozen trees, another Soviet vehicle waited in silence. It looked larger than the T-34 tanks around it. Its armor plates were thicker, its turret heavier, its gun longer and wider. The men inside it were new to this war machine, but they already knew its purpose. It had a name that carried the weight of Soviet pride and propaganda, the IS-2, named after Joseph Stalin himself. But propaganda meant little to the men inside the turret. What mattered was the massive 122mm gun pointing toward the forest road. They had heard the rumors, too. German Panthers were nearly invincible from the front. Their armor was angled perfectly, their guns deadly accurate. Many Soviet crews had died trying to break through Panther formations. But the designers in Chelyabinsk had built the IS-2 for exactly this moment, a heavy hammer against German steel. The Panther tank first appeared on the Eastern Front in July 1943 during the Battle of Kursk. The German army officially called it the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther. It had been designed quickly after German commanders encountered the Soviet T-34 in 1941. The T-34 shocked the Wehrmacht with its sloped armor and wide tracks. German engineers responded by creating something even more advanced. The Panther combined strong frontal armor with the powerful 7.5cm KWK 42L/70 cannon. That gun fired at extremely high velocity. In clear conditions, it could penetrate Soviet armor at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. German tank crews respected it immediately. Soviet crews feared it just as quickly. On paper, the Panther was not a heavy tank. It weighed about 45 tons, which placed it closer to a medium tank category, but its design made it feel much stronger. The front glacis plate was sloped at 55 degrees and measured 80 millimeters thick. That angle made incoming shells bounce away more often than penetrate. The turret front was even stronger. Soviet T-34 guns often struggled to penetrate these areas unless they were very close. In open fields across Ukraine and Belarus, Panthers could destroy Soviet tanks before Soviet gunners even found the range. During the winter of 1943 and early 1944, reports from Soviet armored units became increasingly worried. Tank brigades complained that Panthers could knock out several T-34s before Soviet guns had any real chance of breaking their armor. Crews described shells hitting Panther fronts and simply sliding away. Some Soviet officers even wrote in reports that the German tank appeared almost immune in frontal combat. The phrase traveled quickly across the Red Army, but Soviet engineers were not standing still. Even during the chaos of war, design teams were studying battlefield reports and wrecked German tanks. In the industrial city of Chelyabinsk, sometimes called Tankograd, new heavy tank designs were moving quickly through development. The KV series of heavy tanks had once been the pride of Soviet armor, but by 1943 their design was already becoming outdated. A new tank was needed, something faster than the KV but stronger than the T-34. That tank became the IS series. The IS-2 entered production in late 1943. By early 1944, the first heavy tank regiments were receiving them. At first glance, the IS-2 did not look dramatically different from earlier Soviet heavy tanks, but its most important feature was the massive D-25T 122mm cannon. That gun fired huge armor-piercing shells weighing nearly 25 kilograms. Compared to the smaller shells fired by T-34 tanks, these rounds carried enormous energy. Soviet designers knew the gun had a slower reload time, sometimes around 20 seconds between shots, but they believed that one good hit could destroy almost any German tank in existence. Inside the turret of one such IS-2 that morning near Tarnopol, Lieutenant Alexander Belyaev studied the distant tree line through his gun sight. He had been a tanker since 1942. He had seen friends burn inside knocked-out T-34s. He had seen Panthers at long distance punching through Soviet armor as if it were thin sheet metal. But today, he sat behind a gun that felt different. The barrel was thick and long. The recoil system behind it looked strong enough to tear the turret apart if it failed. When the gun fired, the entire tank seemed to jump backward. The Soviet heavy tank regiment had arrived during the night. Their mission was simple: support an advance by infantry units pushing toward German defensive lines near Tarnopol, and German armored forces were expected to counterattack at dawn. Soviet intelligence believed Panthers from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart might be operating in the area, although exact numbers were unknown. At 7:15 in the morning, the first German engines became audible across the frozen ground. The sound was deep and mechanical, echoing through the forest. Soviet infantry dug deeper into their trenches. Tank commanders lifted their heads from hatches to listen carefully. German armor was approaching. Sergeant Kolesnikov, inside his T-34, saw them first. Through the narrow slit, he spotted movement between the trees. Dark shapes slowly emerged from the forest edge. The distinctive shape of the Panther turret appeared against the pale snow. Its long gun barrel pointed forward like a spear. Behind it, another Panther followed. Within seconds, the battlefield erupted. German tank commanders immediately opened fire. The Panther's high-velocity gun cracked sharply across the field. One Soviet T-34 exploded almost instantly as a shell penetrated its turret ring. Flames burst from the hatch. The shockwave rolled across the snow. Inside his IS-2, Lieutenant Belyaev felt the first impact as a shell struck the ground nearby. Dirt and ice sprayed across the tank's hull. The gunner beside him shouted the range: 800 meters. The Panther was moving slightly left across the field, presenting a partial angle. The Soviet gun crew loaded the massive 122mm shell. It took both men working quickly in the cramped turret. The shell casing scraped against the metal walls as they pushed it into the breach. Belyaev kept his eye on the sight. Outside, the Panther fired again. Another Soviet tank burned. But then something new happened. The IS-2 fired its first shot. The blast from the 122mm gun shook the entire vehicle. A cloud of smoke burst from the muzzle brake. The recoil pushed the gun backward violently. For a moment, visibility disappeared inside the turret. Across the field, the shell struck the Panther. Unlike the smaller Soviet rounds that sometimes bounced off Panther armor, this shell hit with enormous force. It slammed into the Panther's front turret area. The armor did not simply deflect the impact. The kinetic energy shattered the structure. The turret armor cracked inward, fragments tearing through the interior of the tank. German crews had rarely seen anything like it. The Panther stopped moving immediately. Smoke began pouring from its turret. Soviet soldiers nearby watched with disbelief. The German tank that had seemed untouchable was suddenly disabled. Inside Belyaev's IS-2, the loader was already struggling with another shell. The reload was slow, heavy work. Sweat ran down his face despite the freezing air. Outside, more Panthers were maneuvering across the field, trying to find firing angles. The second IS-2 shot landed moments later. This time the shell struck the Panther's front hull. Again, the armor could not absorb the impact. Even when the shell did not fully penetrate, the internal shock sent fragments of steel flying inside the tank. The effect was devastating. German crews later described these hits as feeling like being struck by a giant hammer. The myth of the Panther's invincibility had met its counter. The truth was more complex than battlefield legends suggested. The Panther remained an extremely dangerous tank. Its gun could still destroy IS-2s under the right conditions. But the heavy Soviet shell had introduced a new reality. The Panther's armor, while excellent against medium guns, was not designed to resist such massive projectiles. Throughout 1944, encounters between Panthers and IS-2 tanks became more frequent as Soviet forces pushed westward. Heavy tank regiments equipped with IS-2s were often placed at critical points during offensives. Their mission was not only to break defensive lines, but also to confront German heavy armor. One of the most documented clashes occurred in August 1944 during the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive. The Soviet forces had crossed the Vistula River and established a bridgehead near the Polish town of Sandomierz. German commanders quickly organized armored counterattacks to eliminate the bridgehead before Soviet forces could reinforce it. Among the German units involved were Panthers from the 16th Panzer Division. On August 13, 1944, Soviet heavy tank units from the 71st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment were positioned near the village of Oglindouf. Their IS-2 tanks were partially hidden among buildings and trees. The terrain forced German armor to approach along narrow routes. The morning air in Oglindouf carried the smell of wet soil and burnt fuel from earlier fighting. Soviet crews waited quietly inside their tanks, engines running at low power. Through broken fences and narrow village streets, they could hear the sound of approaching German engines. The Panthers were moving carefully, their commanders confident that their armor and guns still gave them the advantage. When the Panthers advanced into the village, Soviet tanks opened fire from close range. In one engagement, IS-2 Commander Senior Lieutenant Alexander Oskin reportedly destroyed multiple Panthers during a single encounter. His first shot struck the side of a Panther at roughly 600 meters, penetrating the armor and igniting ammunition inside the tank. The explosion lifted the turret slightly from the hull. Another Panther attempted to maneuver around the village houses. Oskin fired again. The massive shell smashed through the turret side. German crews suddenly realized that the new Soviet heavy tanks could kill them even from the front under certain conditions. Their previous confidence began to change. Still, tank warfare remained unpredictable. The IS-2 had strengths, but also weaknesses. Its slow reload time meant that Panther crews who fired first still had a strong advantage. German gunners trained extensively in long-range accuracy. A well-placed Panther shot could penetrate parts of the IS-2 armor, especially at closer ranges or against the turret. But the psychological effect of the 122mm gun was enormous. Soviet infantry described the sound of the IS-2 firing as a deep thunderclap rolling across the battlefield. The shockwave could be felt in the chest. German soldiers learned to recognize that sound quickly. Some German tankers began to treat the IS-2 with the same caution Soviet crews once reserved for Panthers. A German technical reports later revealed that Panther armor could suffer severe internal damage when struck by very large shells, even if penetration did not occur. The shock of impact could break welds, damage optics, and injure crew members with metal fragments inside the tank. This phenomenon was known among tank crews as spalling. Against the huge Soviet 122mm rounds, spalling could be deadly, even when the armor technically remained intact. On the Soviet side, tank commanders were trained to aim carefully because each IS-2 shot mattered. Ammunition storage inside the tank was limited, and reloading took time. Crews practiced quick target acquisition, often waiting patiently for the best moment to fire. Many Soviet tankers described the IS-2 not as a fast dueling tank, but as a powerful ambush weapon. The duel between these two machines represented the constant technological race of the Eastern Front. Every new design forced the other side to adapt. Every battlefield encounter produced new lessons. German engineers attempted to improve Panther armor during later production runs, adding stronger turret mantlets and adjusting internal structures. At the same time, Soviet factories continued to refine the IS-2 design. Early models had a stepped front hull, but later versions introduced the improved straight nose glacis plate, which increased protection against German guns. Production of the IS-2 expanded rapidly during 1944. By the time Soviet forces reached Poland and eastern Germany, hundreds of these heavy tanks were operating across the front. They often advanced alongside T-34 formations and providing heavy firepower during difficult assaults. By early 1945, IS-2 tanks were leading assaults into German territory itself. During the Battle of Berlin in April 1945, these heavy tanks smashed through defensive positions and urban strongpoints. Their large guns were especially useful for destroying fortified buildings. In the narrow streets of Berlin, the IS-2's 122mm shells could collapse entire walls with a single hit. German defenders often hid anti-tank weapons in upper floors or behind rubble. Soviet tank crews moved slowly through the ruins, supported by infantry walking beside the tanks for protection. Panthers still fought fiercely in those final months of the war, but the balance had changed. What once seemed nearly invincible had become just another target for a bigger gun. For the tank crews themselves, the war remained deeply personal. Inside the cramped steel hulls, men relied on each other completely. A gunner trusted his commander's instructions. A loader worked under enormous pressure to keep shells moving into the breach. The driver focused on steering the heavy machine across dangerous ground while shells exploded nearby. Many crews developed strong bonds inside those tanks. Survival often depended on teamwork and calm decisions under extreme stress. Veterans later remembered the intense heat inside the turret after firing several rounds, the smell of oil and burned gunpowder filling the air. They remembered the sudden silence after a successful shot, when everyone inside waited to see whether the enemy tank would stop moving. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. Tank battles were rarely clean duels like those shown in movies. They were chaotic encounters filled with smoke, dust, limited visibility, and constant danger. But certain moments stood out clearly in memory. For many Soviet crews, the first time they saw a Panther destroyed by an IS-2 was one of those moments. It proved something important. The German machines that had once dominated the battlefield could be beaten. If you stand today in the quiet countryside of eastern Poland or western Ukraine, the battlefields of 1944 feel strangely peaceful. Fields stretch across the horizon. Small villages sit quietly along narrow roads. It is difficult to imagine the roar of engines and artillery that once filled these places, but beneath the soil, fragments of steel remain. Pieces of armor plates, shell casings, and rusted tank parts sometimes emerge during farming seasons. Each piece tells a small part of the story. A story about engineers racing against time in distant factories, about young crews inside cramped steel machines, about the moment when one battlefield legend met another. For Soviet tankers who had once feared the Panther, the arrival of the IS-2 marked a turning point. The war was far from over, and victory was still uncertain. But on cold mornings like the one near Tarnopol in March 1944, they learned something important. Even the strongest armor can break, and sometimes all it takes is one massive shell.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.